They were told to run 150 men, most of them sick, some of them couldn't stand up, and they stayed. Outside the walls, 4,000 warriors, who that same morning had wiped out a British army of over 1,000. They had one night and no fort, so they stacked biscuit boxes into a wall, because that was all they had. That wall held, and it wasn't the first time the numbers lied. 18 centuries earlier, an empire had already learned the same lesson the hard way. In the year 61, Rome nearly lost Britain. A queen named Boudica had been flogged, her daughters had been assaulted. Rome had taken her husband's kingdom and treated her family like property, and she answered by burning 3 Roman cities to the ground, including the one that would become London. Her army had grown into something enormous. The Roman writer Tacitus claimed 230,000. Historians today think that number is wildly exaggerated. The real figure was probably somewhere in the tens of thousands, but nobody disputes the basic problem. The Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, had around 10,000 men. Whatever the true ratio was, he was losing it badly, so he refused to fight in the open. He backed his entire army into a narrow gorge, forest at his back, steep walls on both sides, one narrow mouth in front. Boudica's army couldn't surround him. They couldn't flank him, however many warriors she had. Only a few hundred could reach the Roman line at any moment. Her numbers didn't disappear. They just stopped mattering. The Britons had brought their families to watch the victory. Wagons full of them, parked in a ring behind the army. When the charge broke and the Britons turned to run, those wagons were in the way. Boudica's rebellion died in that valley. Rome held Britain for another 350 years. Being outnumbered isn't the problem. Being outnumbered on open ground is. Suetonius survived by taking the enemy's numbers off the table. A man named Hannibal did something harder. He turned them into the weapon. By 216 BC, Rome had had enough of him. He had crossed the Alps with elephants. He had beaten them twice. So Rome did what Rome did best. It built a bigger army. Around 86,000 men, the largest force in its history, Hannibal had roughly 50,000. Hannibal put his weakest troops in the center, on purpose. And he pushed that center forward, so it bulged out toward the Romans like a bow. His best infantry he hid on the wings, holding still, doing nothing. The Romans hit the center, and it started to give way. To them it looked like a breakthrough, so they pushed harder, deeper. The bulge folded backwards into a pocket, and the Romans marched straight into it. Then Hannibal's veterans turned inward from both sides. His cavalry, having scattered the Roman horse, came back and closed the door behind them. 86,000 men surrounded, packed so tightly that men in the middle couldn't raise their arms to fight. A Roman soldier could die that day without ever seeing the man who killed him. Rome lost tens of thousands of men in a single afternoon, one of the deadliest days in the history of warfare. 22 centuries later, it's still taught in military academies, and generals are still trying to repeat it. He didn't beat the numbers, he used them. 2 battles. 2 commanders who looked at a map before they looked at their odds. But the next 2 weren't won by planning at all. One was won by something neither side chose, and the other was won by 150 men who simply refused to leave. Henry V's army should never have been in a battle at all. They had been marching for 2.5 weeks, trying to reach safety at Calais. Dysentery was tearing through the camp. Men were dying on the road without ever seeing an enemy. And then, on a wet field in northern France, the French finally caught them. The numbers are still argued over 600 years later. The Old English chronicles claim 10-1, almost certainly propaganda. Modern historians say 2-1 at best, 6-1 at worst. Take the most generous version, and Henry is still outnumbered 2-1 by an army with the flower of French nobility on the field, in full plate armor on horseback. The battlefield was a freshly plowed farm field, soaked by weeks of rain, with dense woodland squeezing in from both sides. That is the entire battle right there. The French had to attack across plowed mud in armor weighing 60 pounds, into a gap too narrow for their numbers to matter. Men in the back kept pushing forward. Men in the front couldn't move. Some of them drowned standing up, face down in mud, pinned by the weight of the men behind them. And then the arrows came down. France lost a generation of its nobility in an afternoon, on a farm field, to an army that was starving. Sometimes the ground does the fighting for you. And now the wall. January 1879, South Africa. That morning, a British column of over 1,000 men had been destroyed at a place called Isandlwana by a Zulu army the British had dismissed as no real threat at all. It remains one of the worst defeats a European army ever suffered in Africa. 11 kilometers away sat a small mission station called Rorke's Drift, a church, a house, a hospital full of patients, about 150 men fit to fight, and coming toward them, roughly 4,000 Zulu warriors. The garrison was told to run. They looked at the hospital, at the men inside who couldn't walk, and they stayed. There was no time to build fortifications, so they built walls out of what they had. Sacks of grain and wooden biscuit boxes dragged into a rough perimeter connecting the buildings. The attacks began in the late afternoon and did not stop for nearly 12 hours. The hospital caught fire with patients still inside. Soldiers knocked holes through the interior walls with picks and dragged men room by room through the smoke, fighting backwards as the building burned around them. And it's worth saying who was on the other side of that wall. These were the reserve from Isandlwana, regiments held back from the morning's victory and given no part in it. They crossed the river without orders, looking for a battle of their own. No artillery, almost no rifles, no reinforcements behind them. Not a mob, a disciplined army that had destroyed a modern one that morning, attacking on foot into rifles all night. They lost the outer wall. They fell back to a smaller one. They lost that too. By the end, they were holding a tiny redoubt of grain sacks, firing until the barrels of their rifles were too hot to hold. At dawn, the Zulu withdrew. They had been fighting all night, on foot, against rifles, with nothing left to feed the attack. 17 defenders were dead. Several hundred Zulu were. 11 of the survivors received the Victoria Cross, the highest award for gallantry in the British military. 11 from one night, at one tiny mission station. No single action has produced more, before or since. Not one of these was won by soldiers who were braver, or stronger, or better men. Watling Street was won by a valley. Cannae was won by an enemy too confident to notice the trap closing. Agincourt was won by mud, and Rorke's Drift was won by men who decided that running wasn't an option and then kept making that decision hour after hour until the sun came up. The numbers tell you who should win. History is mostly made of the times they were wrong. If you want to know what happened to the man who finally beat Hannibal, that story is on the screen now.